Welcome to Snooze Stories. Tonight, we travel back in time, far back, to an age when the world was darker, wilder, and far less certain than the one you know. An age when kings rose and fell on the strength of their sword arms, when forests stretched endlessly across the heart of Europe, and when the fate of nations could turn on a single battle, a single decision, a single night. Tonight, we tell the story of one man who shaped that world more than almost any other. A man who united kingdoms, built an empire, and left a mark on European civilization so deep, so lasting, that we still feel it today. In our borders, in our laws, in the very idea of what it means to be European. His name was Charlemagne, and this is his story. Before we begin, if you enjoy these historical stories, please subscribe right now and help this channel to grow. Every subscriber genuinely makes a difference for a new channel like this, and the like button pushes this video to more people who want to hear stories like these. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures whose stories you'd like to hear, leave a comment below. Now, settle in. Let the world outside grow quiet. Let the hours slip gently away, and let us walk together through the life of one of history's greatest kings. Charlemagne, a name that still echoes more than 1,000 years after his death, a name spoken in reverence, in wonder, and sometimes in warning. He was a conqueror, yes, a warrior king, a general who led armies across mountains and rivers and vast, untamed plains. But he was also something far more surprising. He was a man who believed, truly believed, that learning, culture, and the life of the mind could transform the world just as surely as any army. He built schools. He gathered scholars from every corner of Europe. He commissioned the copying of ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. He dreamed of an empire not only united by faith and sword, but by knowledge, by order, by a shared vision of what civilization could become. And yet, for all his greatness, Charlemagne was also deeply, unmistakably human. He loved his children with fierce tenderness. He enjoyed music and the simple pleasures of good food and the company of friends. He could be generous and ruthless in the same breath. He made mistakes, some of them grave, and lived with their consequences. His life spanned nearly 70 years, from around 747 to 814. In that time, he transformed the political map of Europe. He defeated the Lombards in Italy, subdued the wild Saxons of the north after decades of brutal warfare, pushed the boundaries of his empire into what is now Spain, Hungary, and beyond. And on a cold Christmas morning in the year 800, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans in the Cathedral of St. Peter's in Rome, the first Western emperor in over 3 centuries. But this is not just a story about conquest. It is a story about one man's extraordinary ambition to hold a fractured, chaotic world together, to bring light into darkness, to build something that could endure. So, close your eyes if you like. Let the night wrap around you like a blanket, and listen as we begin, at the very beginning, not with Charlemagne himself, but with the world he was born into. A world on the edge of something vast and unknown. A world waiting, without knowing it, for a king. To understand Charlemagne, you must first understand the world he inherited. And that world, in the middle of the 8th century, was a place of extraordinary turbulence, a continent still healing from the slow, painful collapse of the Roman Empire, and not yet sure what would rise in its place. Let us begin with a picture. Close your eyes and imagine Europe, not as it looks on a modern map with its neat borders and glowing cities, but as it truly was in the 740s, a patchwork. A mosaic of small kingdoms, tribal territories, and vast stretches of wilderness. Rivers ran wild and untamed. Forests, dense, ancient, and dark, covered much of what is now France, Germany, and beyond. Roads, once the proud arteries of Rome, had crumbled into mud tracks. Travel was slow, dangerous, and uncertain, and power, real power, belonged not to distant emperors or grand centralized states, but to local lords, chieftains, and kings whose authority stretched only as far as their armies could reach. This was the world of the early Middle Ages, and at its heart, in what we would now call France, sat the kingdom of the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic people who had, over the course of centuries, built one of the most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe. Their story began long before Charlemagne, stretching back to the legendary Clovis, who in the late 400s unified the Frankish tribes and converted to Christianity. That conversion was a pivotal moment. It aligned the Franks with Rome and with the Catholic Church, giving them a legitimacy that other Germanic kingdoms, many of which had embraced the rival Arian form of Christianity, simply did not have. For generations after Clovis, the Franks were ruled by his dynasty, the Merovingians. And for a time, the Merovingians were powerful. They expanded Frankish territory, fought off invaders, and maintained a rough but functioning order across their lands. But by the 7th and 8th centuries, the Merovingian kings had begun to fade. It was a slow decline, quiet and insidious, like a crack spreading through old stone. The kings grew weak, not always in character, but in power. They became figureheads, shadows of the authority their ancestors had once commanded. Real power drifted, as it so often does in times of decline, into the hands of the nobility, the great lords and landowners who controlled vast estates, commanded private armies, and increasingly made the decisions that shaped the kingdom. Among these powerful lords rose a family that would change everything. They were called the Carolingians, or sometimes the mayors of the palace. The name comes from their original role. They served as the chief administrators of the Frankish court, managing the king's affairs, organizing the royal household, and over time accumulating influence and wealth that eventually eclipsed even the throne itself. The most famous of these early Carolingian leaders was Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather. Charles Martel was a figure of immense importance, not only to the Franks, but to all of European Christendom. In the year 732, he led the Frankish armies to a decisive victory over a Muslim force that had crossed the Pyrenees from Spain and pushed deep into the heart of France. This battle, fought near Tours, or perhaps Poitiers, historians still debate the exact location, is often remembered as one of the battles that shaped Western civilization. Whether or not that claim is overstated, there is no denying that Charles Martel's victory halted the northward advance of Islam into Europe and cemented the power of his family. Charles Martel never actually took the title of king. He didn't need to. He ruled the Franks in all but name, and when he died in 741, he passed his power and his ambitions to his sons. One of those sons was Pepin the Short, or Pepin the Brief, as he is sometimes called, and Pepin would become Charlemagne's father. But before we turn to Pepin and the family that would produce the most famous king of the medieval world, let us linger for a moment in this wider landscape, for Charlemagne did not rise in isolation. The world around him was restless, dangerous, and full of threats that would shape his life and his reign in profound ways. To the east lay the Saxons. The Saxon tribes occupied a vast territory stretching across what is now northern and eastern Germany, a land of dense forests, marshy lowlands, and fierce independent peoples who had resisted outside domination for generations. The Saxons were pagan. They worshipped the old gods of their ancestors, among them a great sacred tree called the Irminsul, which stood at the heart of their spiritual life. They were skilled warriors, deeply loyal to their own kin and deeply suspicious of outsiders, and they would become for Charlemagne perhaps the greatest and most enduring challenge of his reign. To the southeast, the Avars posed another formidable threat. The Avars were a nomadic people of Eurasian origin, possibly related to or descended from the Huns, who had established a powerful khaganate in the Carpathian Basin in what is now Hungary and the surrounding regions. They were fearsome raiders, and for decades they had terrorized the peoples of Central Europe, demanding tribute and striking deep into Frankish and Bavarian territory. They too would eventually fall to Charlemagne's armies, but that story belongs to a later chapter. To the southwest, across the Pyrenees, lay Muslim Spain. The Umayyad Caliphate had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula in the early 700s, and while their advance into France had been stopped by Charles Martel, they remained a powerful and unpredictable neighbor. The relationship between the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain and the Muslim rulers to the south was complex, sometimes hostile, sometimes surprisingly cooperative, and it would draw Charlemagne into one of the most painful episodes of his life. And then there were the Vikings. In the 740s, Viking raids had not yet begun in earnest. The great age of Norse expansion would come a few decades later, in the late 700s and 800s. But even in this earlier period, the Norse peoples of Scandinavia were beginning to look south and west, toward the rich monasteries and undefended coastlines of Europe. Charlemagne would live to see the first stirrings of this threat, and it would trouble him deeply in his final years. This, then, was the world into which Charlemagne was born, a world of fragile kingdoms and ancient rivalries, a world where Christianity and paganism existed side by side, sometimes in uneasy peace, sometimes in outright war. A world where power was won with the sword and held with vigilance, where a single battle could reshape the map, and where the distance between glory and ruin was often no more than a single season. Into this world, around the year 747 or 748, the exact date is lost to history, a child was born to a Frankish king and queen, a child who would, in time, become the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, a child who would reshape the continent and whose name would echo through the centuries, long after the kingdoms he conquered had turned to dust. But that child's story, truly his story, begins not with his birth, but with his father, with Pepin the Short, with the man who first seized the Frankish crown for the Carolingian dynasty, and who set in motion the chain of events that would lead, inevitably, to the rise of Charlemagne. And that is where we will go next. But for now, let this picture settle in your mind. The dark forests, the uncertain borders, the distant sound of armies on the march, the world vast and wild, waiting for a king. Somewhere around the year 747 or 748, the records do not tell us exactly when, a child was born to the most powerful man in the Frankish kingdom. His name was Charles. In the language of his people, Karl. In history, we would come to know him as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He was born into a family that had already changed the course of European history, and that would change it even more profoundly in the years to come. His father was Pepin the Short, a man whose name might suggest frailty, but whose deeds were anything but small. And his mother was Bertrada of Leon, known to history sometimes as Bertha Broadfoot, though whether this nickname referred to a physical trait or was simply legend, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that she was a woman of intelligence, piety, and considerable influence, and that she would play an important role in the life of her famous son. But before we turn to Charles himself, before we watch him grow from infant to boy, from boy to young man, we must first understand his father. For it was Pepin who set the stage, who laid the foundation, and who made it possible for his son to become the king, and later the emperor, that he did. Pepin the Short was the son of Charles Martel, the great warrior who had defeated the Muslim armies at Tours, and like his father before him, Pepin served as mayor of the palace under the Merovingian kings, those fading ceremonial monarchs who still technically ruled the Franks, but who wielded almost no real power. It was a strange arrangement, one that had persisted for decades. The king sat on the throne, draped in the symbols of authority, while the mayor of the palace commanded the armies, made the decisions, and held the loyalty of the nobles. By the middle of the 8th century, this fiction had become unbearable. Pepin had the power, he had the respect of the warriors, he had the support of the church. What he did not have was the title. And so, in the year 751, he made a decision that would forever alter the course of his family and of Europe itself. Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and had himself crowned king of the Franks. It was a bold, audacious move, one that required not just military strength, but legitimacy. And that legitimacy came from an unexpected source, the Pope. Pope Zachary, and later his successor, Pope Stephen II, supported Pepin's claim to the throne. The church had its own reasons, of course. It needed a strong protector in the west, someone who could defend it against the Lombards, who were pressing dangerously close to Rome. Pepin offered that protection, and in return, the Pope offered something priceless: divine sanction. Pepin was anointed with holy oil in a ceremony that recalled the ancient kings of Israel. He was not just a warrior who had seized power, he was a king chosen by God. This was the world into which Charles was born, a world where his father had just rewritten the rules of kingship, a world where power and religion were bound together in ways both profound and practical, a world where ambition and destiny walked hand in hand. We know frustratingly little about Charles's early childhood. The chronicles of the time were concerned with battles, treaties, and the movements of kings, not with the quiet, unremarkable years of boyhood. But we can piece together a picture from the fragments that remain and from what we know of the time and place in which he grew up. He was born, most likely, in the royal villa at Aachen, or perhaps at another of the Carolingian estates scattered across what is now Belgium and northern France. The royal court was not a fixed place in those days. The king and his household moved constantly, traveling from one estate to another, living off the produce of the land, and ensuring that their presence was felt across the kingdom. It was a peripatetic existence, one that kept the king close to his people and his nobles, and one that would shape Charles's understanding of leadership from an early age. His childhood would have been filled with the sounds and rhythms of court life. The clatter of hooves in the courtyard as warriors arrived with news from distant borders, the murmur of advisors debating in low voices, the chanting of monks in the royal chapel, their voices rising in prayer, and perhaps, too, the laughter of other children, for Charles was not an only child. He had a brother, Charlemagne, born a year or two after him, and together they would grow up in the shadow of their father's ambitions. Pepin was a demanding father, we can assume. A man who had fought his way to the throne would not have raised soft sons. Charles would have been trained from an early age in the arts of war, horsemanship, the use of sword, spear, and shield, the tactics of battle. The Frankish warriors were renowned across Europe for their ferocity and skill, and Charles would have been expected to embody those virtues. But there was more to his education than violence. Pepin, like his father, Martel before him, understood the importance of learning. The Frankish court was not yet the great center of scholarship that it would become under Charlemagne himself, but it was not a place of ignorance either. There were priests and monks who could read and write, who knew Latin, and who understood the texts of the church. Charles would have been exposed to this world as well, the world of letters, of scripture, of ideas. We know that Charles never learned to write with great fluency. This is one of the few personal details that has come down to us, recorded by his biographer Einhard many years later. Einhard tells us that Charles tried, late in life, to master the skill of writing, that he kept tablets under his pillow and would practice forming letters in the quiet hours of the night. But the habit never took. His hands, perhaps, were too accustomed to the weight of a sword. Yet this does not mean he was uneducated. Far from it. Charles could read, and he loved to be read too. He had a deep appreciation for literature, for history, for the wisdom of the ancients, and he would grow into a man who valued learning as much as conquest, a rare combination in any age. There is another quality, too, that seems to have been evident even in his youth, a remarkable physical presence. Charles grew tall, very tall for his time, well over 6 feet, which would have made him tower over most of his contemporaries. He had broad shoulders, a powerful frame, and a commanding voice. He was, in short, impossible to ignore. This physicality would serve him well in the years to come, when leadership often depended as much on personal charisma as on strategic brilliance. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. For now, he was still a boy who rode through the forests of Francia with his brother Charlemagne, a boy who listened to his father's warriors tell stories of distant battles, a boy who watched his father govern and learned, perhaps without fully realizing it, the lessons that would one day make him the greatest king in Europe. Pepin's reign was not a peaceful one. The Franks were constantly at war. To the south, in Italy, the Lombards threatened the Papal States, and Pepin led 2 expeditions across the Alps to defend the Pope and establish Frankish influence in the Italian peninsula. To the east, the Saxons raided and pillaged along the Frankish borders, and Pepin fought them back again and again, though he never fully subdued them. And within the kingdom itself, there were always nobles to be managed, rivals to be placated or crushed, and the delicate balance of power to be maintained. Charles would have witnessed all of this. He may even have accompanied his father on some of these campaigns, as was the custom for young princes. If so, he would have seen firsthand the realities of medieval warfare, the mud and blood, the long marches, the sudden terror of battle. He would have seen how a kingdom was held together not just by laws and loyalty, but by force. And he would have learned, too, the importance of the church. Pepin's alliance with the papacy was one of the cornerstones of his reign. The church provided legitimacy, moral authority, and a network of educated men who could serve as administrators and advisors. In return, the king protected the church's interests and expanded the reach of Christianity into pagan lands. It was a partnership that worked, and it was a model that Charles would carry forward and deepen throughout his own reign. By the time Charles reached his late teens, he was no longer just the son of a king. He was a prince of the Franks, a young man being groomed for power. He was strong, intelligent, and charismatic. He had seen war and peace, power and piety. He had learned the lessons his father had to teach. And then, in the year 768, everything changed. Pepin the Short died. He had ruled the Franks for 17 years, long enough to establish the Carolingian dynasty on a firm footing, but not long enough to see all of his ambitions fulfilled. He was buried with honor, and his kingdom was divided, as was the custom, between his 2 sons. Charles and Charlemagne, brothers, heirs, and now kings. But kingship, as they would soon discover, is not the same as brotherhood, and the years ahead would test them in ways neither could have foreseen. We will come to that story soon, but for now, let us pause. Let this moment settle. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, standing at the edge of his destiny. The son of a great king, the heir to a powerful realm, and the future, vast, uncertain, and full of promise, stretching out before him like the road to an undiscovered country. Rest now. The story continues, and the crown awaits. The year was 768. Pepin the Short was dead, and the Frankish kingdom, that sprawling, unruly realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, was divided between his 2 sons. To Charles the elder went the outer lands, Aquitaine in the southwest, much of the northern territories, and a broad crescent of land wrapping around his brother's holdings like a protective embrace. To Charlemagne the younger went the heartland, the territories around Austrasia, Burgundy, and Provence, the rich core of the Frankish realm, the lands their father had governed most directly. On paper, it seemed a sensible division. In practice, it was a recipe for tension. Frankish custom dictated that kingdoms be divided among sons. It was an old tradition, one that stretched back to the earliest days of the Merovingians and beyond, rooted in the Germanic principle that a father's wealth, and a kingdom was, in essence, wealth, should be shared among his heirs. But tradition, however venerable, does not always serve the cause of peace. And in the autumn of 768, as 2 young kings took their separate thrones, the seeds of rivalry were already being sown. Charles was crowned at Noyon in the north, Carloman at Soissons not far away. The ceremonies were solemn, sacred, the anointing with holy oil, the oaths sworn before God and assembled nobles, the weight of the crown settling onto each young man's head. They were kings now, co-kings, partners in theory in the great work of ruling the Franks. But partnership requires trust, and trust between brothers who have just inherited a kingdom is not always easy to maintain. We do not know what Charles felt in those early days of his reign. The sources are silent on such personal matters, but we can imagine. He was 20, perhaps 21 years old, strong, ambitious, eager to prove himself. He had grown up watching his father command armies, negotiate with popes, hold together a fractious realm through sheer force of will. Now it was his turn, but he had to share that turn with his brother, a brother whose territories cut through the middle of his own, a brother with his own court, his own ambitions, his own vision of how the Franks should be governed. From the start, the relationship between the two kings was strained. Not openly hostile, perhaps. There were no battles fought between them, no declarations of war, but there was coldness, distance, a careful, watchful wariness. The first test came quickly. In 769, just a year after their father's death, a rebellion broke out in Aquitaine. Aquitaine was a troubled land, a region that had long resisted Frankish rule. Pepin had fought there, and so had Charles Martel before him, and still the Aquitanians chafed under northern authority. Now, with Pepin gone and two untested young kings on the throne, they saw an opportunity. A nobleman named Hunald, who had once abdicated his own position and retreated into monastic life, emerged from his cloister, took up arms, and rallied the Aquitanians to revolt. It was a direct challenge to Charles's authority, and Charles responded with swift and decisive action. He raised an army and marched south. And here is where the cracks in the relationship between the brothers began to show. Charles called on Carloman for aid. Aquitaine, after all, was a threat to the stability of the entire Frankish realm. Surely Carloman would send troops. Surely he would stand beside his brother in this first great test of their joint reign. Carloman refused. Or rather, he delayed. He hesitated. He found reasons not to commit his forces. The sources do not give us his exact reasoning, but we can read between the lines. Perhaps he resented Charles's assumption of leadership. Perhaps he saw the rebellion as Charles's problem, not his own. Perhaps he was simply testing his brother, seeing how far he could push before Charles pushed back. Whatever the reason, Charles was forced to campaign alone. And campaign he did. He marched into Aquitaine with grim determination, pursued Hunald through the countryside, and eventually drove him from Frankish territory altogether. Hunald fled south, across the Pyrenees, seeking refuge with the Basque Duke of Gascony. Charles demanded his return. The Duke, wisely, complied. Hunald was handed over, and the rebellion collapsed. It was a victory, Charles's first as king, but it was also a lesson. He had learned that he could not rely on his brother, and that lesson would shape the years to come. The tension between Charles and Carloman deepened. Their mother, Bertrada, saw the danger. She was a woman of considerable political skill, and she understood that a divided kingdom was a vulnerable kingdom. So she did what she could to mediate, to smooth over the conflicts, to keep her sons from tearing apart what their father had built. She arranged marriages. First, she negotiated a match between Charles and the daughter of Desiderius, the Lombard king in Italy. The Lombards had long been a thorn in the side of the papacy, and this marriage was, in part, a diplomatic maneuver to stabilize relations and perhaps ease tensions with Carloman, who had his own connections to the Lombard court. Charles accepted the arrangement, though we do not know how he felt about it. The marriage took place, but it would prove to be short-lived and ultimately inconsequential. Bertrada also tried to foster cooperation between her sons in other ways, through joint councils, through appeals to family loyalty, through the quiet, persistent work of a mother who refused to see her children destroy each other. And for a time, her efforts held the peace. But peace built on such fragile foundations cannot last forever. By 771, the situation had grown unbearable. Charles and Carloman ruled their separate kingdoms, but they barely spoke. Their courts were separate. Their policies diverged. When they did meet, the encounters were formal, cold, marked by mutual suspicion. It was, in every practical sense, a kingdom divided against itself. And then, in December of 771, Carloman fell ill. It happened suddenly, or so the chronicles suggest. One moment he was well, governing his realm from his palace at Samoussy. The next he was bedridden, burning with fever. His condition worsened rapidly. Physicians were summoned, prayers were offered, but nothing helped. Within days, he was dead. He was only 20 years old. The cause of his death is unknown. Some have speculated illness, perhaps a sudden infection, a plague, something the medicine of the time could neither understand nor cure. Others inevitably have whispered darker possibilities: poison, foul play, the hand of an ambitious brother. But there is no evidence for this. The sources record Carloman's death as a tragedy, a sudden and inexplicable loss, and there is no reason to doubt them. Still, one cannot help but wonder what Charles felt in that moment. Relief? Grief? Some complicated tangle of both? He had just lost his brother, a brother with whom he had shared a childhood, a father, a throne. But he had also, in an instant, become the sole king of the Franks. Carloman's widow, Gerbiga, and her young sons, Carloman's heirs, might have posed a problem. Frankish law could have seen the kingdom divided again, the dead king's portion passing to his children. But Gerbiga did not fight. Perhaps she knew it was hopeless. Perhaps she feared for her safety. Whatever her reasons, she fled. She took her sons and sought refuge in Italy, at the court of Desiderius, the Lombard king, the same king whose daughter Charles had married and would soon repudiate. Charles moved quickly. He did not wait for rival claimants to emerge, did not allow the nobles of Carloman's territories time to organize resistance. He marched into his brother's lands with an army at his back, and the nobles, seeing the inevitable, bent the knee. One by one, they swore loyalty to Charles, not to Carloman's sons, not to some compromise arrangement, to Charles alone. By the end of 771, the Frankish kingdom was whole again, united under a single king, and that king was Charles. He was 24 years old. He had been king for only 3 years, and already he had weathered rebellion, navigated the dangerous politics of a divided realm, and emerged in a combination of skill, strength, and sheer fortune as the undisputed ruler of the Franks. But this was only the beginning. The crown he wore now was the crown of the Frankish kings, the same crown his father had worn. It was a great prize, yes, but Charles, we can be sure, was already looking beyond it, already dreaming of something larger, something that would make the Frankish kingdom not just powerful, but unforgettable. He could not have known in that winter of 771 what lay ahead, the wars he would fight, the empire he would build, the legacy he would leave, but the foundation was set. The kingdom was his, the nobles had sworn loyalty, the armies were ready, and the future, vast and unknowable, stretched out before him like the dark forests of Francia, full of danger, full of promise, and waiting to be conquered. Sleep well. The great campaigns are about to begin. If there is one conflict that defined Charlemagne's reign, one war that tested his will, his faith, and his capacity for both mercy and ruthlessness, it was the Saxon Wars. These were not battles fought in a single season or even a single decade. They were a grinding, relentless struggle that spanned more than 30 years, from 772 to 804. 30 years of bloodshed, of broken treaties and surprise raids, of forced conversions and desperate rebellions. 30 years in which Charles fought again and again to bring a proud and fiercely independent people under Frankish rule and Christian faith. The Saxons were not a unified nation. They were a collection of tribes: Westphalians, Eastphalians, Angrians, and Nordalbingians, who occupied a vast territory stretching across what is now northern Germany, from the Rhine in the west to the Elbe in the east, and from the North Sea coast down into the forested interior. They had no king, no central authority. Instead, they were governed by local chieftains and assemblies, bound together by custom, kinship, and a shared devotion to the old gods. They were pagans, and this, more than anything else, made them a target. For Charles, the Saxon wars were never just about conquest, they were about faith, about bringing the light of Christianity into what he saw as a dark and savage land, about fulfilling what he believed to be his sacred duty as a Christian king to expand the boundaries of Christendom and save the souls of the unconverted. But the Saxons did not want to be saved. They wanted to be left alone, and when that was no longer possible, they fought. The conflict began in 772. Charles, now the sole ruler of the Franks, held a great assembly at Worms. There, surrounded by his nobles and advisors, he made the decision to launch a campaign into Saxon territory. The pretext was familiar. Saxon raiders had been troubling the Frankish borders, attacking monasteries, stealing livestock, spreading chaos. But the deeper reason was strategic. Charles wanted to secure his eastern frontier, to establish a buffer zone against other threats beyond, and to extend Frankish and Christian influence into lands that had never bowed to either. He marched his army into Saxony with purpose and determination. The first target was a place called Eresburg, a Saxon stronghold. Charles took it without great difficulty. From there, he pushed deeper into Saxon territory, to a site of immense religious significance, the Irminsul. The Irminsul was a great sacred pillar, a wooden column that stood at the heart of Saxon spiritual life. Some scholars believe it represented the world tree of Germanic mythology, the axis around which the cosmos turned. Others see it as a more localized symbol, a totem of Saxon identity and continuity. Whatever its exact meaning, the Saxons revered it deeply. Charles destroyed it. He ordered his men to cut it down, to tear it apart, to scatter its fragments. It was a deliberate act of desecration, a symbolic declaration that the old gods were powerless, that a new order was coming, and resistance was futile. The Saxons, watching from the edges of the forest, must have felt the blow like a wound to the soul. But Charles did not stop there. He plundered the treasures that had been stored at the Irminsul shrine. Gold, silver, offerings accumulated over generations. He took them back to Francia as trophies, and then, satisfied that he had made his point, he withdrew. It seemed, at first, like a decisive victory. The Saxons had been humiliated. Their most sacred site had been violated. Surely they would submit. They did not. The destruction of the Irminsul did not break the Saxons. If anything, it hardened their resolve. In the years that followed, they raided Frankish territory with renewed ferocity. They ambushed Charles's garrisons, burned churches, killed priests. Every winter, when the campaigning season ended and Charles's armies withdrew, the Saxons rose again. And every spring, Charles had to march back into Saxony and fight the same battles all over again. It became a brutal, cyclical pattern. Conquest, withdrawal, rebellion, and reconquest, over and over and over. In 775, Charles returned with a larger force. He defeated the Saxons in a series of engagements, captured prisoners, and forced many of the tribal leaders to submit. They swore oaths and loyalty. They agreed to accept baptism. They promised peace. And as soon as Charles left, they broke every promise. By now, it was clear that this war would not be won easily. The Saxons were not like other enemies Charles had faced. They had no capital to capture, no king to depose, no single point of failure. They melted into the forests and marshes, struck without warning, and vanished before the Frankish armies could respond. They knew the land in a way Charles's soldiers never could, and they were willing to endure any hardship, any suffering, rather than submit to foreign rule and a foreign god. Charles tried different strategies. He built fortresses deep in Saxon territory, permanent garrisons that could hold the land even in winter. He took hostages from the Saxon tribes, hoping to ensure their good behavior. He brought missionaries, priests who would preach the gospel and establish churches in the newly conquered lands, but none of it worked. The fortresses were besieged, the hostages were abandoned, the churches were burned. And still the war went on. In 782, the conflict reached a terrible turning point. A Frankish army, led by trusted commanders, was ambushed by Saxon forces in the Sentel Hills. It was a catastrophic defeat. Thousands of Frankish soldiers were killed, including several of Charles's closest advisors and nobles. The news reached Charles while he was campaigning elsewhere, and it struck him like a physical blow. He responded with fury. Charles marched into Saxony with vengeance in his heart. He hunted down the leaders of the rebellion, rounded up prisoners, and made a decision that would haunt his legacy for centuries. At a place called Verdun on the banks of the Aller River, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon captives in a single day. 4,500 men, beheaded, their bodies left in heaps along the riverbank. The sources differ in the details. Some suggest the number was exaggerated, others that it may have been even higher, but the core of the story is not in dispute. It happened. Charles, the Christian king who prayed daily and heard Mass with devotion, who built churches and supported monasteries, who would later be hailed as a champion of faith and learning, this same Charles ordered a massacre on a scale that shocked even his contemporaries. Why did he do it? Was it rage at the loss of his men? Was it a calculated act of terror meant to break the Saxons' will once and for all? Was it the grim logic of medieval warfare, where mercy was often seen as weakness and examples had to be made? We cannot know his thoughts, but we know the result. The massacre at Verdun did not end the war. If anything, it made the Saxons even more determined to resist. A new leader emerged, a chieftain named Witikind, a man of extraordinary charisma and courage who became the symbol of Saxon defiance. Under Witikind's leadership, the Saxons fought on, raiding and retreating, refusing to submit, keeping the war alive year after year after year. Charles issued the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a harsh set of laws meant to force the Saxons into submission. Refusal to be baptized was punishable by death. Pagan rituals were forbidden on pain of execution. Eating meat during Lent, burning the dead in the pagan manner, or plotting against the church or the king, all were capital crimes. It was law by the sword, and it was enforced with terrible severity. And yet still, the Saxons resisted. Finally, in 785, something changed. Witikind, perhaps weary of the endless bloodshed, perhaps recognizing that continued resistance would lead only to the destruction of his people, agreed to negotiate. He met with Charles, and in a moment that must have carried immense weight for both men, he accepted baptism. Charles himself stood as Witikind's godfather, a symbolic gesture that bound them in a bond of spiritual kinship. It was not surrender exactly, but it was acknowledgement. The war, at least in its most intense phase, was over. Or so it seemed. In truth, the Saxon wars would drag on for another 2 decades in sporadic bursts. There were rebellions in 792 and again in 793. The Nordalbingians, the Saxon tribes living north of the Elbe, continued to resist into the early 800s. Charles responded with a new strategy: mass deportations. He forcibly relocated thousands of Saxons from their homelands and resettled them in other parts of the Frankish Empire, replacing them with Frankish colonists. It was a brutal tactic, one designed to break the cultural and social bonds that had sustained Saxon resistance for so long. Slowly, painfully, it worked. By 804, the last embers of rebellion had been stamped out. Saxony was no longer a land of free pagan tribes. It was a province of the Frankish Empire, its people baptized, its churches rising where the old shrines had stood, its future bound to the Christian world that Charlemagne was building. The cost had been staggering. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, had died over the course of the conflict. Whole generations of Saxons had known nothing but war, and Charles himself had been forced again and again to make choices that tested the limits of his faith and his humanity. But he had won, and in the eyes of many in his own time, that was what mattered. he had brought a pagan people into the fold of Christendom. He had expanded the boundaries of the faith and secured the eastern frontier of his realm. The Saxon Wars were, in that sense, a success. Yet there is something deeply troubling about this chapter of Charlemagne's life, something that resists the easy narratives of triumph and glory. The Saxons did not ask to be conquered. They did not ask to be converted. They fought with everything they had for their freedom, their beliefs, their way of life. And they were crushed, not just militarily, but culturally, spiritually, utterly. History, we are often told, is written by the victors, and so it is with the Saxon Wars. The chronicles that survive were written by Frankish monks, by men who saw Charles as a hero and the Saxons as stubborn heathens in need of salvation. We do not have the Saxon perspective. We do not have their songs, their stories, their grief. They are silent, or nearly so, lost beneath the weight of the empire that buried them. But we can imagine. We can picture the Saxon mother who watched her son dragged away to be baptized at sword point, the warrior who knelt before a foreign god he did not believe in, knowing that refusal meant death, the elder who saw the sacred groves cut down and the old ways forgotten. We can imagine their sorrow, their rage, their helplessness, and we can hold both truths at once. That Charlemagne was a great king, a visionary, a builder of an empire that shaped the future of Europe, and that he was also a man capable of terrible cruelty, a man who waged a war of conquest and forced conversion that left deep scars on the land and the people he claimed to be saving. The Saxon Wars were over, but the memory of them and the questions they raise would linger long after the last battle was fought. Rest now. There are other wars to come, other victories, other sorrows. But for tonight, let this chapter settle. Let the weight of it rest gently on your mind, and when you are ready, we will move on.
Not every war ends in victory. Not every campaign becomes a triumph. And sometimes, the battles we lose teach us more than the ones we win. In the summer of 778, Charlemagne led an army across the Pyrenees into Spain. It was meant to be a glorious expedition, a chance to strike at the Muslim rulers of Iberia, to extend Christian influence southward, and to add new territories to his growing realm. He had been invited, or so he believed, by local Muslim leaders who were locked in their own internal struggles and who saw an alliance with the powerful Frankish king as a way to gain advantage over their rivals. It seemed like an opportunity too good to pass up. Charles gathered his forces, knights, foot soldiers, supply wagons, siege equipment, and marched south with confidence and ambition. He crossed the mountains, that ancient barrier between the Frankish world and the lands of the Moors, and entered a country that must have seemed both exotic and hostile to his northern soldiers. At first, the campaign went reasonably well. Charles besieged the city of Zaragoza, hoping to take it and establish a foothold in the region, but Zaragoza did not fall. The walls were strong, the defenders determined, and the promised support from the local Muslim factions never fully materialized. What had seemed like a straightforward conquest turned into a grinding, frustrating siege. Worse, news began to reach Charles from the north. The Saxons, ever restless, were rising again. There were reports of raids, of rebellions stirring in the territories he had fought so hard to subdue. He could not afford to linger in Spain while his own kingdom fell into chaos behind him. So Charles made a decision. He lifted the siege. He gathered his army, turned his back on Zaragoza, and began the long march home. It was a retreat, though he would not have called it that. A strategic withdrawal, perhaps. A recognition that this was not the time, not the place for a protracted war in Spain. But whatever name we give it, the truth is simple. The campaign had failed. Charles had crossed the Pyrenees with grand ambitions, and he was leaving with nothing to show for it.
And then, as his army made its way back through the mountain passes, disaster struck. The rear guard of Charles's army, the troops tasked with protecting the supply wagons and ensuring that no one attacked from behind, was moving through a narrow pass in the Pyrenees. The exact location is still debated by historians, but tradition places it at Roncesvalles, a remote and rugged spot where the mountains rise steep and forbidding on either side, and the road winds through a landscape of rock and shadow. It was there, in that lonely pass, that they were ambushed. The attackers were not the Moors, they were Basques, local mountain people who had no love for the Franks, who saw Charles's army as an invading force, and who seized the opportunity to strike at a vulnerable target. They came down from the heights, swift and sudden, falling upon the rearguard with a ferocity that left the Frankish soldiers no time to organize a defense. The battleness was brutal and chaotic. The Basques had the advantage of terrain, of surprise, of intimate knowledge of the landscape. The Frankish soldiers, weighed down by armor and caught in the narrow confines of the pass, could not maneuver, they could not retreat, they could only fight and die. Among the dead were some of the most prominent men in Charles's court: Egihard, the royal seneschal, Anselm, the count of the palace, and most famously, Roland, the warden of the Breton March, a young noble whose name would, in the centuries to come, be transformed into legend.
Charles himself was not present. He was farther ahead with the main body of the army, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding behind him. By the time news of the ambush reached him, it was over. The rear guard had been annihilated, the supply wagons had been plundered, and the Basques had vanished back into the mountains, taking their loot and leaving only corpses in their wake. It was a humiliating blow, not a decisive military defeat. The main army was intact, and Charles was in no danger of being captured or destroyed, but it was a wound to his pride, a stain on what was already a failed campaign. He had lost good men, trusted advisors, friends, and he had lost them not in a glorious battle against a great enemy, but in an ambush by mountain bandits. The chroniclers of the time recorded the event, but briefly. Einhard, Charles's biographer, mentions it in passing, a regrettable incident, a tragedy, but not something to dwell on. The official histories moved quickly past Roncesvalles, eager to focus on Charles's many victories rather than this one bitter defeat. But the story did not die. In fact, it grew. Over the centuries, the ambush at Roncesvalles became the seed of one of the greatest epic poems of the medieval world, the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland. In the poem, Roland is no longer just a noble who died in an ambush. He becomes a hero of almost mythic proportions, brave, loyal, unyielding in the face of impossible odds. The Basque raiders are transformed into a vast Muslim army, and the battle becomes a clash of civilizations, a last stand of Christian valor against the forces of Islam. Roland, mortally wounded, blows his great horn, the olifant, to summon help, the sound echoing across the mountains. But help comes too late. Roland dies, sword in hand, facing his enemies with defiance to the very end. It is a beautiful story, stirring and tragic, but it is not history. It is legend, a legend born from a real event, but reshaped by generations of poets and storytellers into something larger, something that could carry the weight of meaning and memory that the dry facts alone could not. The truth is simpler and sadder. Roland and his companions died in a narrow pass, ambushed by men who had no grand ideology, no great cause, only the desire to strike back at an invading army and take what spoils they could. It was a moment of violence and loss, one among many in an age when such things were common, and for Charles it was a lesson. He had overreached. He had marched into a foreign land without fully understanding the political landscape, without securing reliable allies, without considering the costs of a prolonged campaign so far from home. He had assumed that his reputation, his army, his sheer force of will
would be enough, and he had been wrong. The Spanish expedition taught Charles caution, or at least a different kind of ambition. He would never again attempt a major campaign south of the Pyrenees. He established a defensive zone along the border, a series of fortified regions known as the Spanish March, which served as a buffer between his kingdom and the Muslim-controlled territories beyond. And he turned his attention to other frontiers, other wars, other opportunities. But Roncesvalles stayed with him, we can imagine. The memory of those lost men, the weight of that failure, the knowledge that even the greatest king can stumble, can be caught unprepared, can lose. And perhaps in the quiet hours, when the court was asleep and Charles sat alone with his thoughts, he wondered about Roland, about the young man who died in the mountains, far from home, about the choices that led them there and the choices that led him away, about the fine line between glory and disaster and how easily one can slip from one to the other. The poets would remember Roland as a hero. History would remember the ambush as a footnote. But Charles would remember it as something else, a reminder, a warning, a shadow in the mountains that never quite went away.
While the Saxon wars ground on year after year, and while the memory of Roncesvalles lingered like a bruise, Charlemagne was building an empire. Not all at once, not through a single grand campaign, but piece by piece, kingdom by kingdom, through a combination of military force, strategic marriage, diplomatic maneuvering, and sheer relentless will. 3 conquests stand out in this period of expansion. 3 campaigns that reshaped the map of Europe and brought vast new territories under Frankish rule. First, the Lombards of Italy, then Bavaria, and finally, the Avars, a nomadic empire that had terrorized Central Europe for generations and that Charles would destroy so completely that they vanished almost entirely from history. Let us begin in Italy. The Lombards had ruled much of the Italian peninsula since the 6th century, when they swept down from the north and carved out a kingdom in the ruins of Byzantine power. Their capital was Pavia in the north, and their influence stretched across the rich plains of Lombardy, down through the central duchies and even into the southern reaches of the peninsula. They were a powerful people, proud and independent, and for centuries they had been a thorn in the side of the papacy. The popes, ruling from Rome, were caught in a difficult position. They were surrounded by Lombard territory, threatened by Lombard ambitions, and yet they had no army of their own to defend their interests. So they turned, as they had before, to the Frankish kings. And in the early 770s, as tensions between the Lombards and the papacy escalated, Pope Hadrian I sent an urgent appeal to Charles. The Lombard king, Desiderius, was pressing his claims aggressively. He had designs on papal lands, and he was also sheltering Gerberga, the widow of Charlemagne, Charles's late brother, and her young sons, who might still pose a rival claim to the Frankish throne. Desiderius was, in essence, challenging Charles on multiple fronts. And Charles, who had once been married to Desiderius's daughter in a short-lived diplomatic arrangement, now saw the Lombard king not as an obstacle, but as an obstacle. In 773, Charles made his decision. He would cross the Alps and settle the matter by force. It was a bold move. The Alps were a formidable barrier, and invading Italy was no simple matter. But Charles had momentum, confidence, and a cause he could frame as righteous, the defense of the Holy See. He gathered his army and marched south. The Lombards tried to stop him at the mountain passes. They fortified the narrow defiles, hoping to block the Frankish advance and force Charles to turn back. But Charles was too clever for that. He divided his forces, sent a portion of his army through an alternate, less defended pass, and outflanked the Lombard defenses. The Lombards, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, retreated in disorder. Charles swept down into the Lombard heartland. He besieged Pavia, the capital, and settled in for what would become a months-long siege. The city was well fortified and well supplied, and it did not fall quickly. But Charles was patient. While his army surrounded Pavia, he traveled to Rome to meet with Pope Hadrian. It was Easter of 774.
Charles entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim and protector. He was received with great ceremony, celebrated as the defender of the Church, the strong arm of Christendom. He renewed the donations that his father Pepin had made to the papacy, pledges of land and support that bound the Frankish kingdom ever closer to Rome. And in that moment, standing in the city of the Caesars, Charles must have felt the weight of history, the sense that he was not just a barbarian king from the north, but something more, an heir to a legacy that stretched back to the very foundations of the Christian world. He returned to Pavia, and the siege continued. Finally, in the summer of 774, the city surrendered. Desiderius was taken prisoner, sent into monastic exile, and the Lombard kingdom was no more. Charles did not install a new Lombard king. He did not divide the spoils among his nobles. He took the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself. He became, in a single stroke, not only king of the Franks, but also king of the Lombards. It was a turning point. Italy, or at least the northern and central portions of it, was now part of the Frankish realm. And Charles had demonstrated that his ambitions extended far beyond the forests and rivers of Francia. He was building something larger, something that would one day be called an empire. But there were other challenges, other frontiers to secure, and one of the most pressing lay to the southeast, in Bavaria. Bavaria was technically part of the Frankish sphere of influence. It was ruled by a duke, Tassilo III, who was Charles's cousin. Their mothers were sisters. But Tassilo had ideas of his own. He governed Bavaria with considerable independence, maintaining his own court, his own policies, and his own alliances. He had married a Lombard princess, the daughter of Desiderius, which had once tied him to the very kingdom Charles had just destroyed. And he had at times shown a troubling lack of loyalty to the Frankish crown. Charles tolerated the situation for a time. He had other wars to fight, other matters to attend to. But by the mid-780s, he had decided that Tassilo's semi-independence could no longer be allowed. Bavaria was too strategically important, too wealthy, and too close to other potential threats to remain outside of direct Frankish control.
In 787, Charles summoned Tassilo to a royal assembly and demanded that he renew his oaths of loyalty. Tassilo complied, but the relationship remained strained. The following year, Charles accused Tassilo of treachery, of plotting against the Frankish throne, of making secret alliances with the Avars, of breaking his oaths. Whether these charges were true or fabricated, we cannot know for certain, but the outcome was clear. Tassilo was deposed, forced into a monastery, and Bavaria was absorbed directly into the Frankish kingdom. It was a bloodless conquest, achieved more through political maneuvering and the threat of force than through actual battle, but it was a conquest nonetheless. And it gave Charles control over a critical region, one that opened the door to his next great campaign, the war against the Avars. The Avars were a mystery, even to their contemporaries. They were a nomadic people, possibly of Turkic or Mongolic origin, who had established themselves in the Carpathian Basin, the great plains of what is now Hungary, in the 6th century. For more than 200 years, they had dominated Central Europe, raiding the surrounding kingdoms, demanding tribute, and building a reputation for ferocity and wealth. They were horsemen, masters of mounted warfare, and their military tactics were both terrifying and effective. They lived in a vast fortified complex known as the Ring, a series of circular earthwork fortifications, one inside the other, protecting their treasure hoards and their seat of power. And those hoards were legendary. Centuries of plunder, tribute from fearful neighbors, gold and silver and precious goods accumulated over generations. By the late 8th century, the Avars were still powerful, but they were no longer invincible. Internal divisions had weakened them, the rise of the Frankish kingdom to the west and the expansion of Slavic tribes from the north had hemmed them in, and Charles, having secured Bavaria, now saw an opportunity. In 791, he launched the first of a series of campaigns against the Avars. It was not a single decisive battle, but a grinding, systematic effort to break their power.
Charles led his armies deep into Avar territory, attacking their fortifications, scattering their forces, and destroying the infrastructure that had sustained their dominance for so long. The campaigns were difficult. The terrain was unfamiliar, the distances vast, the enemy elusive. But Charles was relentless. He coordinated attacks from multiple directions, using Bavarian troops, Slavic allies, and his own Frankish forces to squeeze the Avars from all sides. And in 796, the ring itself was breached. The treasure within was staggering. Wagon after wagon filled with gold, silver, jewels, silks, and precious objects of every kind. It was the accumulated wealth of an empire, the plunder of centuries, and it was all carted back to Francia. Einhard, Charles's biographer, wrote that the treasure was so vast that it transformed the economic fortunes of the Frankish kingdom overnight. It funded churches, monasteries, and palaces. It enriched the nobility. It demonstrated in the most concrete terms imaginable that God had blessed Charles's campaigns with victory. But the Avars themselves, the people, the culture, the civilization, were shattered beyond recovery. They never regained their former power. Within a few generations, they had ceased to exist as a distinct people, absorbed into the Slavic and Germanic populations that moved into the region. They became a ghost story, a memory, a cautionary tale about the impermanence of empires. For Charles, the destruction of the Avars was a triumph. It secured his eastern frontier. It brought vast new lands under his control. It filled his coffers and strengthened his position at home and abroad. And it added one more title to the growing list of realms he ruled. The conqueror of the Avars, the pacifier of Central Europe, the king whose reach now extended from the Atlantic to the plains of Hungary. But there was something else, too, something quieter, harder to define. With each conquest, with each new territory absorbed into his realm, Charles was becoming something more than just a king. He was becoming the embodiment of Christendom itself. The warrior who defended the faith, the ruler who brought order to chaos, the man who stood at the center of a vast and growing world. And that transformation, that slow shift from king to something greater, would reach its culmination in a few short years in a city far to the south, on a cold December morning when the weight of an empire would settle onto his shoulders in a way he could never have fully anticipated. But that story comes later. For now, let us rest in this moment of triumph. The Lombards defeated, Bavaria secured, the Avars destroyed, the empire expanding, the borders stretching, the future bright with possibility. Sleep gently. The crown is not the end, it is only the beginning.
By the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne stood at the pinnacle of power in Western Europe. He ruled the Franks, the Lombards, the Bavarians, and vast stretches of territory from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. His armies had defeated the Saxons, crushed the Avars, and secured the frontiers of his realm against enemies on every side. He was, by any measure, the most powerful ruler the West had seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. But he was not yet an emperor. And there is a difference, subtle perhaps, but profound, between a king, however great, and an emperor. Kings rule kingdoms. Emperors rule the world, or at least they claim to. The question of empire, of what it meant and who could claim it, had haunted Europe for centuries. The Western Roman Empire had fallen in 476 when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, had survived in Constantinople, and its rulers still claimed the title of Roman Emperor, still saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of Augustus and Constantine. But in the West, there had been no emperor for more than 300 years. The title was vacant, or so it seemed. And into that vacancy, slowly, almost inevitably, Charlemagne began to move. The path to empire began not with Charles, but with the Pope. In 795, a new pope was elected in Rome.
His name was Leo III, and he was not a man of noble birth. He had risen through the ranks of the church through talent and ambition, but he lacked the powerful family connections that often protected papal authority. And from the moment of his election, he faced opposition, bitter, dangerous opposition from rivals within the city who saw him as an upstart, a usurper, a man who did not belong on the throne of St. Peter. Leo understood that he needed a protector, and so, almost immediately after his election, he reached out to Charles. He sent envoys to Francia bearing gifts and a message of loyalty and friendship. He acknowledged Charles as the defender of the church, the strong arm upon which the papacy could rely. And Charles, in turn, accepted that role. It was a natural partnership, an extension of the alliance that his father Pepin had forged decades earlier. But it would soon become something much more. In April of 799, the tensions in Rome exploded into violence. Leo's enemies, led by powerful Roman nobles who despised him, ambushed the Pope during a religious procession. They dragged him from his horse, beat him savagely, and attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were calculated mutilations designed to disqualify Leo from holding ecclesiastical office. A pope who could not see, who could not speak, could not lead the church. But Leo survived. By some accounts, his sight and speech were miraculously restored. By others, the attack was simply not as thorough as his enemies had intended. Either way, he escaped Rome with the help of loyal supporters, fled north across the Alps, and sought refuge with the one man who had both the power and the will to restore him, Charlemagne. Charles received Leo with honor at his palace in Paderborn, in Saxony. The two men met, talked, and made plans. Charles promised to investigate the charges against Leo. His enemies had accused him of various crimes and moral failings, and to see justice done. But it was clear from the start that Charles intended to support the Pope. Leo was, after all, his ally. And more than that, Leo represented an opportunity, a chance to bind the papacy even more tightly to the Frankish throne, and to position himself as the ultimate arbiter of authority in the Christian West. In the autumn of 800, Charles led an army to Rome. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a protector, a judge, a king come to restore order. A council was convened. Leo's accusers were summoned to present their case, but the proceedings were, in many ways, a formality. Who could judge a pope? Not his accusers, certainly, not even a king, perhaps, though Charles came close. In the end, Leo was allowed to swear an oath of innocence, and that oath was accepted. His enemies were punished, exiled, or silenced, and Leo, restored to his full authority, remained pope. But something else was happening beneath the surface of these events, something that would change everything.
It was December. The year 800 was drawing to a close. Christmas was approaching, and Rome was filled with pilgrims, nobles, clergy, and the usual bustle of a great religious festival. Charles, as was his custom, attended Mass at the Basilica of St. Peter on Christmas Day. He knelt before the altar, praying, his head bowed in devotion. And then Pope Leo approached him. He held a crown in his hands, a golden crown glittering in the candlelight. And as Charles knelt there, surrounded by the assembled crowd, Leo placed the crown upon his head and proclaimed him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. The crowd erupted in acclamation. They cheered, they sang, they declared Charles's new title with a fervor that must have shaken the very stones of the basilica. And Charles, what did Charles feel in that moment? Surprise? Triumph? Uncertainty? According to Einhard, Charles's biographer, Charles claimed afterward that he had not wanted the coronation, that he had been taken by surprise, that if he had known what Leo intended, he would never have entered the church that day. But few historians believe this account. Charles was not a man easily surprised. He was a shrewd politician, a master of symbolism and power. He must have known that something was being planned.
He may not have known the exact form it would take or the precise moment it would happen, but the coronation was the culmination of years of alliance, negotiation, and mutual dependence between himself and the papacy. It was, in a sense, inevitable. And whether he wanted it or not, the crown was now on his head. He was no longer just king of the Franks and the Lombards, he was emperor. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For the first time in over 3 centuries, there was a Roman emperor in the West. The title that had been vacant since the fall of Rome, the title that represented the unity of Christendom and a legacy of the ancient world, had been revived. And it had been given not by the acclamation of the Roman Senate, not by the authority of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, but by the Pope. This was a new kind of empire, a Christian empire, an empire that derived its legitimacy not from pagan Rome, but from the Church, from God, from the sacred duty to protect and expand the faith. And at its head stood Charlemagne, warrior, king, defender of the Church, and now emperor. But the coronation also created problems. The Byzantines, who still saw themselves as the true Roman Empire, were furious. They did not recognize Charles's claim. They saw him as a barbarian usurper, a Frank who had stolen a title that belonged by ancient right to the emperors in Constantinople. There would be years of tense diplomacy, threats, and negotiations before Byzantium grudgingly acknowledged Charles's imperial status, and even then, the recognition was never wholehearted. For Charles, the coronation was both a culmination and a complication. It elevated him to a plane of authority no Western ruler had occupied for centuries. It made him the symbolic head of all Christendom, the protector of the Church, the earthly counterpart to the spiritual authority of the Pope. But it also bound him more tightly to Rome, to the expectations of that role, and to the delicate and sometimes dangerous politics of the papacy. Still, there is no denying the power of the moment. Picture it, the great basilica filled with light and voices, the smell of incense, the weight of history pressing down on every soul present, and at the center of it all, a man who had risen from the son of a usurper king to become the ruler of an empire. A man who had fought for decades to expand the borders of his realm and the reach of his faith. A man who now wore a crown that connected him, however tenuously, to Augustus, to Constantine, to the grandeur and glory of Rome itself. The world had changed, a new age had begun, and at its dawn stood Charlemagne, emperor of the Romans, his face turned toward a future that only he could shape. Rest now. The crown is heavy. The work is far from over. But tonight, let us pause in the glow of that Christmas morning when the impossible became real and a king became an emperor.
Empires are not built by swords alone. They are built by ideas, by culture, by the slow and patient work of preserving knowledge and passing it forward to the next generation. And Charlemagne, for all his skill as a warrior and strategist, understood this truth perhaps better than any ruler of his age. He had conquered vast territories. He had defeated enemies on every frontier. He had been crowned emperor of the Romans and stood as the undisputed leader of Western Christendom. But conquest, he knew, was only the beginning. To truly build an empire, to create something that could endure beyond his own lifetime, he would need more than armies. He would need scholars, teachers, scribes, and architects. He would need books, schools, and a culture that could bind his diverse and sprawling realm together with something stronger than fear or loyalty alone. What emerged from this vision was one of the most remarkable cultural movements of the medieval world, the Carolingian Renaissance. It was not a Renaissance in the sense we usually mean the word. It did not produce the soaring art of Michelangelo or the philosophical revolutions of the later European Renaissance, but it was, in its own way, a rebirth, a deliberate, sustained effort to recover the learning of the ancient world, to raise the level of education across the Frankish Empire, and to create a literate,
cultured class of clergy and administrators who could help govern the realm and preserve its traditions. And at the center of it all was Charlemagne himself. Charles could not write fluently, as we have noted, but he loved learning. He loved to be read to engage in intellectual conversations, to surround himself with learned men who could teach him about history, theology, grammar, and the stars. He studied Latin, though he never mastered it with the ease of a native speaker. He learned Greek, or at least enough to understand the liturgy. He read the works of St. Augustine and other church fathers, and he insisted that his children, both his sons and his daughters, receive a thorough education, something that was far from common even among the nobility of the time. But Charles did not keep this love of learning to himself. He wanted to spread it, to make literacy and education more widely available, to ensure that the clergy who served in his churches and the officials who administered his laws were capable, knowledgeable, and trained. And so he set about building an infrastructure of learning that would transform the intellectual landscape of Europe. The heart of this effort was the palace school at Aachen. Aachen was Charles's favorite residence, the place he returned to again and again throughout his reign. It was more than just a palace. It was a complex of buildings, a seat of government, a center of culture, and a symbol of his power. The great hall where he held court and received envoys from distant lands, the chapel with its soaring arches and glittering mosaics modeled on the churches of Ravenna and Rome, and the palace school where the brightest minds of the age gathered to teach, to study, and to debate.
Charles recruited scholars from across Europe to come to Aachen, and the most famous of these, the man who would become the intellectual architect of the Carolingian Renaissance, was an Englishman named Alcuin of York. Alcuin was a scholar, a teacher, and a theologian of extraordinary ability. He had been educated at the Cathedral School in York, one of the finest centers of learning in the British Isles, and he had a deep knowledge of Latin literature, theology, and the liberal arts, the 7 subjects that formed the foundation of medieval education: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. When Charles met Alcuin in Italy in 781, he was so impressed that he invited the scholar to join his court. Alcuin accepted, and for the next decade and a half, he served as Charles's chief advisor on educational matters and as the master of the palace school. Under Alcuin's guidance, the palace school became a beacon of learning. It was not a university in the modern sense, nor even a formal institution with fixed curricula and degrees. It was more like a circle of intellectuals, nobles, clergy, and even members of Charles's own family who gathered to study, to discuss texts, to write poetry, and to engage in the kinds of intellectual exercises that would have been unthinkable in most courts of the time. They gave each other playful nicknames drawn from classical and biblical sources. Charles was David, after the great king of Israel. Alcuin was Flaccus, after the Roman poet Horace. Others took names like Homer, Pindar, and Naso. It was a learned game, a way of connecting themselves to the great traditions of the past, and it reflected the spirit of the entire enterprise, a revival, a reaching back across the centuries to reclaim what had been lost. But the palace school was only one part of Charles's educational reforms. He also issued a series of decrees, capitularies, that mandated the establishment of schools throughout his realm. Every cathedral, every monastery was to have a school where boys could be taught to read and write, to understand the scriptures, and to sing the liturgy properly. These were not schools for the masses. Education was still a privilege reserved for the clergy and the nobility, but they represented a significant expansion of literacy and learning, and they laid the groundwork for the monastic and cathedral schools that would flourish in the centuries to come. Central to this effort was the reform of Latin itself. By the 8th century, the Latin language had fragmented into regional dialects and variations. The Latin spoken and written in one part of the empire might be barely comprehensible to someone from another region. This made communication difficult, and it threatened the unity of the church and the administration of the realm.
Alcuin and his fellow scholars set out to standardize Latin, to restore it to something closer to the classical form used by Cicero and Virgil. They established rules of grammar and spelling, corrected errors that had crept into texts over the centuries, and promoted a clear, elegant style of writing. The result was what we now call Carolingian minuscule, a new script, clear and legible, that replaced the cramped and often illegible scripts that had been used in earlier centuries. This script became the standard for writing in Western Europe, and it is, in fact, the ancestor of the lowercase letters we use today. But the Carolingian Renaissance was not just about Latin and grammar, it was about preserving knowledge, and that meant copying books. In the scriptoria, the writing rooms of monasteries across the empire, monks labored day after day, year after year, copying manuscripts by hand. They copied the Bible, of course, and the works of the Church Fathers, but they also copied the texts of pagan antiquity, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Seneca, and many others. These were not Christian writers, but Charles and his scholars recognized their value as models of eloquence, as repositories of wisdom, as links to the grandeur of the ancient world. Without the Carolingian Renaissance, many of these texts would have been lost forever. The manuscripts that survive from the 9th century, copied in Carolingian scriptoria, written in Carolingian minuscule, are often the only surviving copies of works that would otherwise have vanished. We owe much of our knowledge of classical Latin literature to the patient labor of these Carolingian scribes. Music, too, flourished under Charles's patronage. He was deeply concerned with the proper performance of the liturgy, and he invited singers and musicians from Rome to teach the Frankish clergy the correct way to chant the Gregorian melodies. These chants, named after Pope Gregory I, were the foundation of medieval Christian worship, and Charles wanted them to be sung uniformly and beautifully throughout his empire. He established schools of singing, and he insisted on a high standard of musical performance in his churches. And then there was architecture. If you visit Aachen today, you can still see the chapel that Charlemagne built, the Palatine Chapel, one of the finest examples of Carolingian architecture in existence. It is an octagonal building, soaring and grand, with a great dome rising above the central space. The design was inspired by the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, which Charles had visited and admired. But the Palatine Chapel is not a copy, it is an adaptation, a synthesis of Roman, Byzantine, and Germanic traditions. The chapel was filled with treasures, columns of marble brought from Italy, mosaics glittering with gold, bronze doors crafted by skilled artisans. It was a place of beauty and power, a physical manifestation of Charles's vision for his empire. And when he sat in the gallery above, looking down on the clergy and nobles gathered below, he must have felt the weight of history, the sense that he was creating something that would outlast him. The Carolingian Renaissance was not perfect. It was limited in scope, confined mostly to the clergy and the elite. It did not reach the common people, who remained largely illiterate and untouched by the world of books and learning. And it was fragile, dependent on Charles's patronage, his vision, his will. When he died, much of the momentum would be lost. The empire would fracture, and the schools and scriptoria would struggle to maintain the standards he had set. But for a brief, shining moment, something remarkable happened. In the midst of what we often call the Dark Ages, there was light. There was learning, culture, beauty, and the preservation of knowledge. There were men and women who believed that the past mattered, that books were worth copying, that education was worth fighting for. And at the center of it all was a king who could barely write his own name, but who understood, deeply, profoundly, that an empire built only on swords would crumble into dust. An empire built on ideas, on learning, on the slow and patient cultivation of the mind and the soul, that was an empire that could endure. Sleep gently. There are laws to be written, a kingdom to be governed. But tonight, let us rest in the quiet of a scriptorium, where a monk bends over a page, his quill moving carefully, preserving the words of Virgil for a future he will never see. Let us rest in the knowledge that not all battles are fought with swords, and not all victories are won on the field. Some are won one word at a time, in the stillness of a candlelit room. An empire is not a single thing. It is not a palace or a crown or even an army. It is a vast, sprawling organism. Thousands of towns and villages, hundreds of lords and bishops, millions of people living their lives, tending their fields, raising their children, praying to their God. And to hold such a thing together, to keep it from splintering into chaos, requires more than charisma or military might. It requires structure. It requires law. It requires a system of governance that can reach from the emperor's court to the farthest corners of the realm. Charlemagne understood this, and throughout his reign he worked tirelessly to build the institutions, the laws, and the relationships that would allow him to govern effectively, not just as a conqueror, but as a true emperor. The challenge was immense. The Carolingian Empire was not a unified nation in the modern sense. It was a collection of different peoples: Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, Aquitanians, and many others, each with their own languages, customs, and traditions. There were no telephones, no telegraphs, no quick ways to communicate across hundreds of miles of forest and mountain. A message sent from Aachen to the Spanish March might take weeks to arrive, and by the time it did, the situation on the ground might have changed entirely. How, then, could one man govern such a realm? The answer lay in delegation, in trust, and in a carefully constructed system of local authority bound by personal loyalty and the threat of royal displeasure. At the local level, the empire was divided into counties, administrative regions, each governed by a count. These counts were drawn from the Frankish nobility, men of wealth and power who held their positions at the emperor's pleasure. Their duties were extensive. They collected taxes, raised troops for the army, administered justice, maintained order, and enforced the emperor's laws within their territories. In return, they received land, income, and the prestige that came with serving the emperor directly. It was, in theory, an effective system, but it was also vulnerable to abuse. Counts were powerful men, often far from the watchful eye of the court. They could exploit their positions, oppress the people under their authority, or even challenge the emperor if they grew too bold. Charles needed a way to keep them in check, to ensure that they were governing justly and loyally. His solution was the Missi Dominici, the emperor's messengers. The Missi Dominici were envoys, usually sent out in pairs, one a churchman, the other a layman, who traveled throughout the empire on behalf of the emperor. They inspected the counties, heard complaints from the people, reviewed the conduct of the counts, and ensured that the emperor's laws were being followed. They were, in essence, Charles's eyes and ears, a way of projecting his authority even into the most distant corners of his empire. It was not a perfect system. The Missi Dominici could only visit so many places in a year, and their presence was temporary. Once they left, a corrupt count might simply resume his old ways. But it was better than nothing, and it sent a clear message. The emperor was watching. No one, no matter how powerful, was beyond his reach. The laws themselves were issued through documents called capitularies, collections of royal decrees that covered everything from military organization to the proper conduct of the clergy, from the punishment of criminals to the management of royal estates. Some capitularies were general, meant to apply across the entire empire. Others were specific, tailored to the needs of a particular region or people. The capitularies revealed Charles as a ruler deeply concerned with justice, order, and morality. He legislated on matters both grand and mundane. He set penalties for theft, murder, and perjury. He ordered weights and measures to prevent merchants from cheating their customers. He ordered the churches be maintained in good repair, that priests be properly educated, and that the liturgy be performed correctly. He even issued laws governing the treatment of animals and the upkeep of roads and bridges. But above all, the capitularies reflect Charles' vision of a Christian empire. For him, there was no separation between the secular and the sacred. The emperor's duty was not just to maintain order and defend the realm, but to ensure the salvation of his people. He saw himself as responsible before God for the spiritual as well as the temporal welfare of his subjects. This was a bold and, in some ways, radical claim. It placed the emperor at the very heart of the church's mission as a partner and sometimes a superior to the clergy themselves. Charles took this role seriously. He convened church councils where bishops and abbots gathered to debate matters of theology and discipline. He issued decrees on religious practice, correcting what he saw as errors or abuses. He insisted that the clergy live moral lives, free from corruption and vice. And he did not hesitate to rebuke even the highest-ranking churchmen if he believed they were falling short of their duties. His relationship with the papacy was particularly complex. On one hand, Charles was the church's protector. He had defended Rome, but above all, the capitularies reflect Charles' vision of a Christian empire. For him, there was no separation between the secular and the sacred. The emperor's duty was not just to maintain order and defend the realm, but to ensure the salvation of his people. He saw himself as responsible before God for the spiritual as well as the temporal welfare of his subjects. This was a bold and, in some ways, radical claim. It placed the emperor at the very heart of the church's mission as a partner and sometimes a superior to the clergy themselves. Charles took this role seriously. He convened church councils where bishops and abbots gathered to debate matters of theology and discipline. He issued decrees on religious practice, correcting what he saw as errors or abuses. He insisted that the clergy live moral lives, free from corruption and vice. And he did not hesitate to rebuke even the highest-ranking churchmen if he believed they were falling short of their duties. His relationship with the papacy was particularly complex. On one hand, Charles was the church's protector. He had defended Rome, restored Pope Leo III to his throne, and received the imperial crown from the Pope's own hands. He funded churches and monasteries, supported missionaries, and waged war against pagans in the name of spreading the faith. But he was also, increasingly, a ruler who saw himself as equal or nearly equal to the Pope in authority. He did not believe that the Pope could dictate to him, or that the Church could operate independently of imperial oversight. He saw the empire as a Christian commonwealth, with the emperor as its head and the Pope as its spiritual guide, but with ultimate authority resting in the hands of the secular ruler. This tension between the emperor and the Pope, between temporal and spiritual authority, would become one of the great themes of medieval European history. It would erupt into open conflict in later centuries as popes and emperors battled for supremacy. But in Charles' time, the relationship remained mostly cooperative, held together by mutual need and by the towering personality of the emperor himself. Charles also saw law as a tool for unification. His empire was diverse, yes, but he wanted it to be bound together by shared values, shared beliefs, and a shared sense of Christian identity. The capitularies were not just administrative documents, they were expressions of a vision of a realm where justice prevailed, where the strong did not oppress the weak, where the church flourished, and where every person from the lowest peasant to the highest noble knew their place and their duties. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps even an impossible one, but Charles pursued it with the same determination he brought to his military campaigns. He believed that law, properly enforced, could transform society. He believed that a Christian emperor ruling justly and piously could bring order to a chaotic world. And in many ways, he succeeded. The Carolingian Empire, for all its flaws and fragility, was more orderly, more literate, and more unified than the Frankish kingdom had been a generation earlier. The counts administered their territories with at least a baseline level of competence. The missi dominici kept corruption in check to some extent. The capitularies provided a framework for justice and governance that endured in some regions for centuries after Charles's death. But there were limits to what law could accomplish. The empire was too large, the distances too great, the diversity of its people too profound. Local customs often clashed with imperial decrees. Powerful nobles found ways to circumvent the law or to interpret it in their favor. And the church, for all its alliance with the throne, remained a force with its own agenda, its own hierarchy, and its own conception of authority. Still, Charles never stopped trying. He issued capitularies till the very end of his reign, refining his laws, addressing new problems, striving always to bring his unruly empire into closer alignment with his vision of what it should be. And if he did not fully succeed, if the empire remained imperfect and fractured, well, perhaps that's simply the nature of empires. They are always striving, always incomplete, always caught between the ideal and the real. But in the striving, there is greatness. And Charles, for all his faults, was a man who never stopped striving. He wanted his empire to be just, to be orderly, to be worthy of the title he bore. And he worked with every tool at his disposal to make that vision real. Sleep softly. The laws are written. The counts are at their posts. The missi dominici ride through the countryside, carrying the emperor's word to the farthest reaches of the realm. And at the center of it all, in the great hall at Aachen, sits Charles, emperor, lawgiver, judge. A man who holds the world in his hands and who knows better than most how fragile that hold can be. Rest now. There are more stories to tell. But for tonight, let the machinery of empire hum quietly in the background. Let the laws stand and the order hold, if only for a moment longer.
It is easy when we talk about emperors and conquerors to forget that they were human, that beneath the crown and the armor, beneath the weight of history and the demands of power, there was a person, a man who laughed and grieved, who loved and lost, who had habits and quirks and fears just like anyone else. Charlemagne was no exception, and if we want to understand him, truly understand him, we must look past the grand narratives of conquest and coronation and see the man as he was, in his daily life, in his relationships, in the small moments that do not make it into the chronicles, but that reveal, perhaps more than anything else, what it meant to be Charles. Let us begin with his appearance. We are fortunate to have a description of Charles from Einhard, his friend and biographer, who knew him well. Einhard tells us that Charles was a large man, tall and powerfully built, with a thick neck and a prominent belly in his later years. He stood well over 6 feet, an imposing height in an age when most men were considerably shorter. His face was round and pleasant, his eyes large and lively. He had a strong nose and a mane of white hair that he kept relatively short, in the Frankish style, rather than the long, flowing locks of his Merovingian predecessors. His voice was clear and strong, though Einhard notes, somewhat surprisingly, that it was higher than one might expect from a man of his size. He dressed simply, usually in the traditional Frankish manner, a linen shirt and breeches, a tunic fastened with a silk border, and a blue cloak in winter. He disliked elaborate clothing and foreign fashions, and only on the most formal occasions, at the insistence of the Pope or on great feast days, would he don the ornate robes and jeweled regalia of an emperor. He was a man of prodigious energy. He loved physical activity, hunting, riding, swimming. He was an excellent horseman and an avid hunter, spending long days in the forests chasing deer and boar. But most of all, he loved to swim. At Aachen, he built baths fed by the natural hot springs that bubbled up from the earth, and he would spend hours in the warm water, often inviting his sons, his nobles, and even members of his court to join him.
Einhard tells us that sometimes as many as 100 men would be swimming together, splashing and laughing in the great pools. But Charlemagne was not all vigor and vitality. As he aged, his health began to decline. He suffered from fevers, and in his final years he developed gout, a painful condition that made walking difficult and left him increasingly immobile. He also limped slightly, the result of an old injury, or perhaps simply the wear of decades spent in the saddle and on campaign. Still, he refused to let these ailments slow him down more than necessary. He continued to hunt, to travel, to govern, even when the pain must have been considerable. His personal life was complicated, as the personal lives of powerful men often are. Charlemagne was married multiple times. The exact number is unclear, as the sources sometimes disagree, and the distinction between marriage and concubinage was not always sharply defined in that era. But we know of at least 4 wives, and possibly 5. His first wife, or perhaps his first serious relationship, was with a woman named Himiltrud, with whom he had a son, Pepin the Hunchback. But this union was set aside, likely for political reasons, when Charles married Desiderata, the daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius. That marriage lasted less than a year before Charles repudiated her, again for political reasons, as his relationship with the Lombard king soured. His third wife was Hildegard, a Swabian noblewoman, and she seems to have been the great love of his life. She bore him 9 children, including his sons Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis, who would eventually succeed him as emperor. Hildegard was intelligent, capable, and beloved by Charles. Her death in 783, at the age of only 25 or 26, was a profound blow to him. He mourned her deeply, and though he would marry again, none of his later wives seem to have held the same place in his heart. After Hildegard came Fastrada, a Frankish noblewoman, and then Luitgard. Charles also had several concubines, and he fathered at least 18 children in total, a mixture of legitimate heirs and children born outside of formal marriage. He adored his children, all of them. He kept his daughters close to him, refusing to let them marry, a decision that has puzzled historians, as it meant they could not produce legitimate heirs or forge useful political alliances. Perhaps he simply could not bear to let them go. Perhaps he did not trust anyone else to care for them as he did. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, he feared that a son-in-law might become a rival, a threat to his son's claims to the throne. His daughters, in any case, lived at court, educated and cultured, and several of them had relationships, some quite open, with members of the nobility. Charles seems to have tolerated this, even though it scandalized some of the more austere churchmen at his court. He loved his daughters, and he wanted them near him. That, in the end, was what mattered most. His sons were raised to rule, trained in warfare and statecraft from an early age. Charles the Younger and Pepin of Italy were both capable men, and Charles placed great trust in them, giving them authority over large portions of the empire. But both of them died before their father. Charles the Younger in 811, Pepin in 810. These losses were devastating. To outlive your children is a grief that never fully heals, and Charles felt it keenly. Only Louis, the youngest of Hildegard's sons, survived to inherit the empire. And Louis, though pious and well-meaning, was not the warrior his father had been. Charles must have known this, must have worried about what would happen to the empire after his death, but there was nothing to be done. The succession was settled. Louis would be emperor. Beyond his family, he had friendships, deep, enduring friendships with men like Einhard and Alcuin. He loved conversation, debate, and the company of learned men. He would sit for hours discussing theology, history, or the movements of the stars. He had a curious mind, always asking questions, always wanting to understand. He also had a temper. He could be stern, even harsh, when he believed it was necessary. He was not a man who tolerated disloyalty or incompetence, and he could be ruthless when dealing with enemies. But those who knew him well also knew his warmth, his generosity, his capacity for forgiveness. He was, in short, a complicated man, capable of great cruelty and great kindness, often in the same breath. Music moved him deeply. He loved the chanting of the liturgy, the beauty of the Gregorian melodies that filled his chapel. He supported musicians and singers, and he insisted that the music in his churches be of the highest quality. Some sources suggest that he himself had a good singing voice, though this may be more legend than fact. He loved nature, too. The forests and rivers of his realm, the changing seasons, the simple pleasure of a ride through the countryside on a clear morning. He was not a man who spent all his time in palaces and council chambers. He needed to be outside, to feel the wind, to see the sky. And he was, despite all his power, a man who knew loss. He lost wives, children, friends. He saw the fragility of life, the inevitability of death. And perhaps that knowledge, that awareness of mortality, shaped him as much as any battle or coronation. In his later years, as his body slowed and the weight of the empire pressed ever more heavily on his shoulders, Charles must have looked back on his life with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in what he had accomplished, the realm he had built, the order he had imposed, the legacy he would leave. But sorrow, too, for the things he had lost, for the violence he had inflicted, for the imperfections of the world he had tried so hard to perfect. He was a man, in the end, not a legend, not a myth, but a man. Flawed, brilliant, driven, tender, fierce, and deeply, unmistakably human. Sleep now. The man rests, as all men must. The crown lies heavy on the table beside him. The empire stretches out beyond the walls of the palace, vast and restless. But for now, in this quiet hour, he is simply Charles, a father who has lost children, a husband who has known love, a man who has tried, in his own way, to do what he believed was right. Rest gently. There is still more to come. But tonight, let us remember that even emperors are mortal, and that behind every great name in history, there is a heart that beats and breaks and hopes, just like our own.
Time does not stop, not even for emperors. And as the 9th century dawned, Charlemagne, now in his 60s, an age that few men of his time reached, began to feel the weight of his years. The body that had once been so strong, so tireless, was slowing. The mind remained sharp, but the flesh was failing. And the empire, that vast creation he had spent a lifetime building, was showing signs of strain. The borders, once secured by force of arms and the sheer momentum of conquest, were under pressure again. New threats were emerging, and old enemies were stirring. And Charles, though still emperor in name and authority, was increasingly forced to confront the reality that he could not personally lead every campaign, could not be everywhere at once, could not hold the world together by will alone. To the north, the Danes were becoming a problem. Denmark, at the edge of the known world, had long been a remote and somewhat mysterious place to the Franks. But by the early 800s, the Danish king, Godfred, was growing bold. He raided the northern coasts of the Frankish Empire, attacked the Slavic tribes that had submitted to Frankish authority, and even built a great defensive wall, the Danevirke, to protect his own territory from Frankish incursions. Charles responded as he always had, with force. He sent armies north, built fortifications along the border, and established the region as a new march, a militarized frontier zone designed to hold back the Danish threat. But the Danes were not like the Saxons or the Avars. They were seafarers, mobile and elusive, able to strike quickly and retreat before the Frankish forces could respond. And they were growing more organized, more ambitious, more dangerous. In 810, King Godfred launched a major raid along the Frisian coast, devastating towns and monasteries, and demonstrating that the northern frontier was far from secure. Charles prepared a massive counteroffensive, gathering troops and ships for what would have been one of the largest campaigns of his later years. But before the campaign could be launched, Godfred was assassinated by one of his own men. The Danish threat receded, at least for a time, and the planned invasion was called off. Charles had been spared the ordeal of another long war.
But the incident was a reminder that the empire's enemies were not going away, and that new generations of warriors, hungrier and more restless than their fathers, were rising beyond the borders. To the south, in Spain, the situation was equally frustrating. Charles had never forgotten the failure at Roncesvalles, and he had never fully achieved his ambitions in Iberia. The Spanish March, the buffer zone he had established along the Pyrenees, remained contested and unstable. Muslim emirs launched raids into Frankish territory, and the local Christian lords were often more interested in their own independence than in loyalty to a distant emperor. Charles's son, Louis, had been given authority over Aquitaine and the Spanish March, and he had some success in pushing back against the Muslim incursions. But it was slow, grinding work, and the dream of a great Christian reconquest of Spain remained just that, a dream. The border held, more or less, but it was a constant drain on resources and attention. And then there were the Northmen, the Vikings. In the early 800s, the age of Viking expansion was just beginning. The Irish longships at Lindisfarne in 793 had shocked the Christian world, and in the years that followed, Norse longships appeared with increasing frequency along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. They came without warning, struck fast, and vanished before any defense could be organized. Charles understood the danger. He ordered the construction of coastal defenses, the establishment of naval patrols, and the fortification of monasteries and towns along the vulnerable shorelines. But these measures were only partially effective. The Vikings were too mobile, too unpredictable, and as Charles's strength waned, the threat only grew. It must have weighed on him in those final years, the sense that the world was changing, that new dangers were rising, and that he might not live long enough to see them defeated. He had spent his life securing the empire, but security, it seemed, was always temporary, always fragile, always in need of defense.
His health was failing. The gout that had plagued him for years grew worse, making it difficult for him to walk or ride. He suffered from recurring fevers. His appetite, once robust, began to decline. Einhard tells us that in his final years, Charles ate sparingly and drank little wine, contrary to the advice of his physicians, who urged him to consume more to maintain his strength. He knew he was dying, and with that knowledge came the urgent need to settle the succession. Charles had always intended for his realm to be divided among his sons in the traditional Frankish manner, but fate and death had intervened. Charles the Younger, his eldest surviving son and the one he had groomed most carefully for leadership, died in 811. Pepin of Italy, another capable son, had died the year before. Of all Charles's legitimate sons, only Louis remained. Louis the Pious, as he would come to be known, a devout, earnest man, deeply religious, but lacking his father's charisma and his instinct for command. Charles must have had doubts. He must have wondered if Louis would be strong enough to hold the empire together, to defend it against the threats that were already gathering on the horizon. But there was no choice. Louis was the only legitimate heir. And so, in September of 813, Charles summoned a great assembly at Aachen. He called together the nobles, the bishops, the great men of the realm, and he made his intentions clear. Louis would succeed him as emperor. In a solemn ceremony, Charles himself placed the imperial crown on Louis's head. It was an unprecedented act. Emperors traditionally were crowned by the Pope, but Charles, even in his final year, was asserting his authority, his independence, his belief that the emperor's power came from God, not from Rome. He crowned his son, blessed him, and instructed him in the duties that lay ahead. It was a passing of the torch, a recognition that the time had come to let go. And it must have been for Charles both a relief and a sorrow. Relief that the succession was settled, that the empire would not fall into chaos after his death, but sorrow, too, for all the things Louis would have to face, and for the knowledge that the empire Charles had built might not survive intact under a less forceful hand. Charles also prepared his will. He divided his vast personal wealth, the treasure accumulated over a lifetime of conquest, among his heirs, the church, and the poor. He was generous in his bequests, ensuring that churches and monasteries would be funded, that the needy would be cared for,
and that his family would be provided for. But the empire itself, the realm, the territories, those would go to Louis, undivided. Charles had learned, perhaps, that division led to weakness, and he wanted his empire to remain whole. In those final months, Charles spent most of his time at Aachen. He could no longer travel as he once had. The palace, with its great hall and its beloved chapel, became his world. He prayed, he received visitors, he watched the seasons change through the windows, and he thought, perhaps, about all that he had done and all that he had left undone. Did he have regrets? We cannot know, but it is hard to imagine that a man of his intelligence and self-awareness did not, in those quiet hours, reflect on the cost of his ambitions, the wars, the deaths, the suffering, the Saxons forced to convert at the point of a sword, the children he had outlived, the fragile nature of the peace he had imposed. But he had also built something remarkable, an empire that stretched across Western Europe, a revival of learning and culture, a legal and administrative system that would shape the continent for centuries, a vision of Christian unity that, however imperfect, had brought order to a chaotic world. He had been a great king, and he knew it, and whatever doubts or sorrows he carried, there was also surely a sense of accomplishment. He had done what few men could do. He had changed the world. And now the world would have to go on without him. Sleep gently. The crown has been passed. The will is written. The empire stands for now secure and whole. But the man who built it is tired, so tired, and the winter is closing in. Rest now. One more chapter remains, one final journey. But for tonight, let us leave Charles at Aachen, surrounded by the things he loved, his family, his chapel, his books. Let us leave him at peace for just a little longer. Winter came to Aachen in the year 814, a cold, bitter winter, the kind that settles deep into the bones and will not let go. And in the palace, in the rooms he had known for so many years, Charlemagne was dying. He had been ill since autumn, a fever at first, nothing unusual for a man of his age, nothing that seemed immediately alarming. But this fever did not break. It lingered, burning through him, draining his strength day by day. He took to his bed, and as the days turned to weeks, it became clear that he would not rise from it again. The court grew quiet. The great hall, usually filled with the noise of governance and debate, fell still. Nobles and bishops gathered, waiting, watching, praying. His family surrounded him, his son Louis, his daughters, the grandchildren he had doted on. They sat vigil, as families do, holding on to the last precious hours. Einhard, his friend and biographer, was there, and he recorded what he saw, the final days of the man who had been emperor, king, conqueror, and friend. Charles, Einhard tells us, remained lucid until near the end. He knew what was happening, he knew he was dying, and he faced it with the same resolve he had brought to everything else in his life. He made his confession, he received the sacraments, he prayed, his voice growing weaker, but his faith, we are told, unwavering. He had spent his life as a Christian emperor, and he would die as a Christian man. On the morning of January 28, 814, just after 9 o'clock, Charlemagne drew his last breath. He was 71 years old, or perhaps 72. The exact year of his birth, as we have noted, is uncertain. He had ruled for more than 45 years. He had been emperor for 14, and now he was gone. The body of the emperor was prepared for burial with all honor and reverence due to his station. He was dressed in his imperial robes, the crown placed upon his head one final time. According to some later traditions, though these may be more legend than fact, he was buried sitting upright on a throne, holding a scepter in one hand and a book of the Gospels in the other, as if he was still ruling, still watching over his realm even in death. He was laid to rest in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, the church he had built, the place he had loved more than any other. The The chapel's arches rose above him, the mosaics glittered in the candlelight, and the voices of the choir filled the air with the chants he had worked so hard to perfect. It was a fitting resting place for a man who had believed so deeply in the power of faith, learning, and beauty. The news of his death spread slowly across the empire. In an age without telegraphs or instant communication, word traveled at the speed of a horse, carried by messengers who rode from town to town, from monastery to monastery, bearing the somber news, "The emperor is dead." The reaction was profound. For most people living in the Carolingian Empire, Charles had been the only emperor they had ever known. He had been a constant, a fixed point in a world that was often chaotic and uncertain. His presence had loomed over Europe for nearly half a century, and now, suddenly, he was gone. In churches across the realm, prayers were offered for his soul. Monks in scriptoria paused in their work to remember the man who had supported their labors, who had funded their monasteries, who had believed in the importance of their work. Nobles, many of whom owed their positions to Charles's favor, wondered what the future would hold under his son Louis. And common people, who had lived under his rule, who had been conscripted into his armies or paid taxes to his collectors, processed the news in their own quiet ways. The chroniclers and historians of the time wrote tributes. They praised his piety, his strength, his wisdom, his devotion to the church. They called him the father of Europe, the defender of Christendom, the greatest king since the fall of Rome. Some of this was genuine admiration. Some of it was the expected rhetoric of the age, the language of power and legitimacy. But beneath the formal language, there was real grief, real recognition that something extraordinary had ended. Louis the Pious, now sole emperor, moved quickly to consolidate his authority. The transition was smooth, at least initially. Charles had planned well. The succession was clear, the nobles had sworn their oaths, and there was no immediate crisis. Louis took up the reins of power and set about governing in his own way, more cautious than his father, more deferential to the church, less comfortable with the grand gestures and the bold decisions that had defined Charles's reign. But the empire Charles had built was already beginning to show cracks. It was too large, too diverse, too dependent on the force of a single personality to hold it together. Louis would do his best, and he would rule for more than a quarter of a century, but he lacked his father's gifts, and the empire, over time, would fracture. By the end of the 9th century, it would be divided among Louis's sons, and those divisions would become the seeds of the modern nations of France, Germany, and Italy. But that story belongs to another time. For now, in the winter of 814, the empire stood. The laws were still in force, the borders, for the moment, were secure, and in the chapel at Aachen, the emperor lay in his tomb, silent and still, while the world he had shaped continued to turn. There is a temptation, when we think about death, to look for meaning, for closure, for some final judgment on a life. Was Charlemagne good or bad? Was his empire just or tyrannical? Did he build something worth building, or was it all vanity and violence? The truth, as always, is more complicated. He was a man of his time, a time of war, of faith, of stark choices and brutal realities. He did things we would find unforgivable. He also did things that were genuinely great. He saved the papacy. He revived learning. He brought order to a chaotic world. And he left a legacy that shaped Europe for 1,000 years. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we do not need to judge him, only to understand him, to see him as he was, a man who wanted to be remembered, who wanted to leave the world better than he found it, and who succeeded, in his own complicated way, in doing just that. Sleep now. The emperor is at rest. The chapel is quiet. The candles burn low, and the night deepens. And somewhere, beyond the walls of Aachen, the empire he shaped continued to turn.